There's something about a cult that always seems to fascinate people. The Manson Family, Jonestown, the Branch Davidians, they've all become, for better or worse, cultural touchstones in people's minds over the decades. So it seems obvious then that, when applied to the larger-than-life world of pro wrestling, a cult should make for a perfect heel group. And though it had been tried before, it was never quite perfected until the Wyatt family came along. But while much of this is due to the creative mind of their leader Bray Wyatt, the contributions of their other members can't be underestimated either. So how did the group come together, and how did they pan out in the WWE? Well, join us today as we take a deep dive into the faction's entire run from start to finish in Follow the Buzzards, the Wyatt Family Story. It all started in 2012, not long after a young Husky Harris had been sent back down to Florida Championship Wrestling following his run with the Nexus. And of course, that run, which we've covered elsewhere on the channel, had spectacularly fizzled out towards the end, with this leaving the real-life son of Mike Rotunda dead in the water, as he was forced to try and come up with something new instead. Luckily though, Harris was, even by then, one of the best creative minds on the roster, and so it didn't take him long to start developing a new gimmick for himself, one of a backwoods Bayou cult leader named Bray Wyatt, with this being heavily inspired by 90s superstar Waylon Mercy, who was in turn inspired by Robert De Niro's performance as Max Cady in the 1991 Martin Scorsese remake of Cape Fear. Initially associating himself with Eli Cottonwood then, Wyatt would quickly make his mark in FCW right as he was preparing to morph into NXT later that summer. And when it happened, he would continue to pick up wins over the likes of Aiden English, all until July when he would suffer a pectoral tear that took him out of action for the next few months. But this turned out to be a blessing in disguise in the end because instead of disappearing from TV altogether, the cult leader would finally get to build a cult around him when he adopted his new sons in the form of Luke Harper and Eric Rowan, having them go out and do his bidding while he waited at ringside in his signature rocking chair. And while Harper and Rowan were busy dominating the NXT Tag Team division, winning the tag team titles at one point, Wyatt would be preparing himself for his own in-ring return, a return which eventually came on February 21, 2013, when he made quick work of Yoshitatsu. After that, the group tried to recruit Bray's real-life brother Bo Dallas too, but this would end up being to no avail, as Dallas would not only refuse, but would actually hand his shoot sibling his first loss under the gimmick on March 13th. So angry and looking to bounce back, the Wyatts would spend the next few months feuding with Corey Graves and NXT general manager William Regal, eventually taking on both them and Adrian Neville in a six-man tag on the June 26th episode of the Black and Gold brand. And that would end up being their swan song to the brand as it happened because, after Bray pinned Regal during that match, the group would be moved up to the main roster as, by then, Vince McMahon had seen the potential superstar stable he had on his hands. Yes, the boss had already been priming audiences for the introduction of the Wyatt family since the end of May, with the company airing spooky vignettes of their leader informing fans everywhere that they were coming. And come they would on the July 8th episode of Raw when they attacked Kane, with this only being the first of many similar beatdowns as it turned out, because in the weeks that followed, they would also take out the likes of R-Truth, Justin Gabriel, and 3MB, all while sending cryptic messages to the Big Red Machine to follow the Buzzards. And this would immediately lead to a Ring of Fire match at that August SummerSlam, where Bray would take on Kane one-on-one while the ring was surrounded by flames. But while the match itself didn't turn out to be anything special that night, the spectacle and the chance to finally see Wyatt in the ring was enough to get it over as, already by then, fans were taking to the new act in droves. And this would only continue in the weeks that followed, as the heels would go on something of a winning streak from there, eventually starting their next high-profile feud in November when they came up against Daniel Bryan in a 3-on-1 handicap match, a match that they would predictably win. But victory wasn't enough for Bray and his cronies at that point, as he wanted to capture the very soul of the American Dragon, and this was what would lead the group to spend the next few weeks trying to integrate Bryan into their cult, routinely wearing him down until eventually, on the final Raw of 2013, he would give in and join the family, seemingly turning heel in the process. In the end though, this would all turn out to be a ruse, as during a steel cage match pitting Bray and Bryan against the Usos on the January 13th, 2014 episode of The Red Brand, the American Dragon would reveal that he'd been stringing the heels along the whole time, laying out Wyatt from there once he had him safely locked inside a cage. But of course the cult leader wouldn't take this lying down. No, he would immediately seek revenge, something he would eventually get when, at the Royal Rumble later that month, he would not only beat the fan favorite, but kayfabe injure him too, keeping him out of the Rumble match later that night. After that, Bray and his family would start focusing their attention on the other big stable in WWE at that time, The Shield, when the two found themselves inadvertently getting in each other's crosshairs on the January 27th episode of Raw. And this would lead to the dream match fans had been waiting to see for months at that point, as the two teams faced off in a six-man tag at February 23rd's Elimination Chamber, a match which didn't disappoint as it would turn out to be one of the best bouts of the year. And to make matters better, when things were all said and done that night, it would be the Wyatt family who would be the victors, with this only helping to raise their belief in themselves that much further as they next set their sights on the face of the company himself, John Cena. But of course, by that point, calling Bray and his cronies heels would be a push as, despite the fact that they were clearly still being portrayed as villains everywhere they went, you wouldn't have known that by listening to the fans, most of whom had well and truly drank the Kool-Aid by then as they exploded in approval whenever the Wyatts theme hit, from there raising their phone torches in the air to signify that they had decided to follow the Buzzards and become a part of the movement. And as the build to Bray vs. Cena at WrestleMania 30 started to increase then, audiences made their choice clear as they seemed to agree fully with the cult leader's assessment of Big Match John's career as one which represented an era of lies. The only way to resolve this in his mind, in fact, would be for the perennial babyface to turn to the dark side, something the Wyatts desperately tried to get him to do in the weeks that followed. Ultimately, though, they would not be able to do this, and at WrestleMania 30, when every fan in the building was fully behind Bray, singing "He's got the whole world in his hands" in unison as he conducted them like an orchestra, Cena would resist the urge to use a steel chair so as to get the upper hand, instead throwing this aside and beating the up-and-comer clean in a moment that stood in stark contrast to the message of the new generation rising up that was featured everywhere else on the card. Still, the family would get their chance for revenge when a month later, Bray and Cena would have a rematch at May 4th's Extreme Rules, with things this time being held inside a steel cage where, in a goofy moment, a small child with a voice modulator would distract Big Match John for long enough for Wyatt to get the win. Yes, despite the victory, it seemed like the group was veering worryingly close to the level of Scooby-Doo villains at this point, and it certainly didn't help their woes when at June 1st's Payback, Cena would end the feud by beating Bray again, this time in a last man standing match that managed to undo any of the good achieved from the month before. After that, there was a definite feeling that the momentum of the Wyatt family had cooled, so, hoping to recover from this then, Harper and Rowan would stake their claim in the tag team division as they went after the tag champs the Usos that summer. As well as that, Bray would refocus his attentions, deciding to enter the Money in the Bank ladder match at that June's titular pay-per-view, the very same show where his minions would finally get their shot at the tag titles. Sadly though, all three would fail to get the victories that night, and to make matters worse, the next month at Battleground, Harper and Rowan would fail to beat the Usos once again while, elsewhere on the card, their leader was losing clean to Chris Jericho, with this only serving to increase the growing perception that the Wyatt family were becoming little more than a group of glorified jobbers. Yes, even if Bray was eventually able to get his win back, by now, the die appeared to have been cast on the group as just another victim of WWE's creative team, with all the promise they had as a superstar act seeming to have evaporated in a downward spiral that began after Wyatt lost to Cena at WrestleMania. So, trying to shake things up then, the company would decide to split the act that September, with this being done in the laziest and most anticlimactic fashion possible when, rather than build a story around the breakup, Bray just announced in a pre-taped vignette that he was setting his minions free from there on in. And perhaps predictably then, things would not improve for each Wyatt family member after this as, while Bray got into a feud with Dean Ambrose that only ended up hurting the stock of both men, Luke Harper's brief run as Intercontinental Champion would be aborted before it could really ever get a chance to start. All while elsewhere, Eric Rowan was struggling to make any mark as a singles competitor at all. Yes, it was clear to most by now that, at least with Wyatt, who remained one of the best creative minds in the company, and Harper, who was one of the most underutilized big men in wrestling at that point, it wasn't a lack of ability that was holding them back, it was having to deal with WWE's creative direction for them. Thankfully then, things would start to show some signs of improvement when on the May 7th, 2015 episode of SmackDown, Harper and Rowan would reunite as a heel act, with them from there resuming their dominance of the tag team division for a while. But even this would rarely see them get to appear on the A shows, as they instead spent most of their time competing on the likes of Superstars and Main Event. No, it wouldn't be until July 19th's Battleground that things really got going once again, as it was then that Luke Harper would interfere in Bray Wyatt's match against Roman Reigns, helping him to pick up the win as the stable would reform from there. Sadly though, this reunion would be slightly hindered after Eric Rowan picked up a bicep injury around this time, taking him out of action for a period as Wyatt and Harper continued on as a tag team for a while. That would be until the August 24th episode of Raw, of course, at which point the newest member of the stable, Braun Strowman, was introduced. And immediately making an impact, Braun would lay waste to Dean Ambrose and Roman Reigns, from there acting as the new silent heavy of the group while the other two picked up most of the slack. And this ended up finally being a winning combination for the Wyatts again as, at September 20th's Night of Champions, the trio of heels would defeat Ambrose, Reigns, and Chris Jericho in a six-man tag match. After that, Eric Rowan would return to complete the foursome as, now seemingly unbeatable, they set their sights on The Undertaker after attacking him at the October 25th Hell in a Cell pay-per-view, then ritualistically carrying him backstage in much the same way as they had his brother Kane 2 years prior. Of course, this would see the Big Red Machine himself return to seek revenge for his brother, with all that leading to a tag team match pitting Wyatt and Harper against the newly reformed Brothers of Destruction at November's Survivor Series. But in a decision that only served to hobble them all over again, the Wyatts would end up losing this match with the same downward trajectory that had dogged them before, starting up once more after this as, following all four men's failure to win the WWE title during the 2016 Royal Rumble, Harper and Bray would lose a handicap match against Brock Lesnar at March 12, 2016's Roadblock, when the cult leader refused to get in the ring. And behind the scenes, the reason for this was that he was suffering from a back injury, which would largely keep him out of action for the immediate future. But he wasn't the only member of the family who was nursing an injury, as Luke Harper would also hurt his knee at this time, with this being bad enough to take him out of competition for the next 7 months. So now limited by what they could do, the remaining Wyatt family members suffered the ultimate humiliation when at WrestleMania 32 on April 3rd, they were relegated to the role of cannon fodder for The Rock after he verbally eviscerated Bray, then defeated Eric Rowan in an impromptu 6-second match. After that, the neutered group tried to recover by undergoing a soft babyface turn when they started a brief feud with the League of Nations in April of that year, with Bray at this point even solidifying this by teaming up with his once hated enemy Roman Reigns. In the end though, that new direction would be cut short, as at a live event in Italy later that month, the cult leader would injure his calf, with this putting him out of action for a while again and causing the whole Wyatt Family / League of Nations program to be scrapped. When he and the rest of the family, minus Luke Harper of course, did return to action in June, they would find themselves going up against the New Day, and this would end up leading to WWE's first foray into the cinematic match on the July 11th episode of Raw, when the babyface trio showed up at the Wyatts' compound to brawl with their rivals. Following that, they would meet in a more formal 6-man tag match at July 24th's Battleground where, in a moment that felt like a rarity by this point, the Wyatt family would pick up the win. But any momentum they might have been building from this would be hobbled once again during that year's draft as, already seeing Braun Strowman as his next big singles star, Vince McMahon would choose to separate him from the rest of the group, placing him on Raw while moving Bray and Eric Rowan over to SmackDown. And to make matters worse, after being drafted, Rowan would suffer a torn rotator cuff that would put him out of action until the following year. Luckily then, Luke Harper would be cleared to return to action around this time, and on the October 9th edition of the Blue Brand, he would end up appearing so as to reunite with his mentor. That said, at this point, Bray wasn't just content to have his two original minions by his side, as by now, he'd set his sights on a far greater catch, that being Randy Orton. So over the next few weeks, the Wyatts would make Orton's life a living hell as they continually tried to brainwash him into joining their side. And after a while, this seemed to work, as by November, the Viper was helping them to win matches, this seeming to confirm that he had turned to their side. In fact, at that month's Survivor Series, where both Bray and Randy found themselves on the same team during the 5-on-5 SmackDown vs. Raw elimination match, the student would actually save the master by jumping in the path of a spear from Roman Reigns towards the close of the bout, with this only solidifying his allegiances going forward. So now, seemingly a solid unit then, Wyatt and Orton would defeat Heath Slater and Rhino to win the SmackDown Tag Team titles at December 4th's Tables, Ladders, and Chairs pay-per-view, with this marking the stable's first title win on the main roster. And with the Freebird rule in place, this meant that all three active members of the group could defend the belts whenever they chose. Still, for as good as things looked to be going, there was one man who wasn't convinced of Randy Orton's new alignment, and that was Luke Harper. With that in mind then, the two would begin to show signs of dissension in the weeks that followed, with this eventually leading to them losing the tag titles to American Alpha on the December 27th episode of SmackDown. And following this, things would get even worse when Bray, believing that Orton was being genuine, hit Harper with his sister Abigail during a match between his two bickering proteges, with this seeming to confirm his exclusion from the group going forward. Out for revenge then, Harper would try to eliminate both of his former teammates from the 2017 Royal Rumble match the following month, but in the end, he would be unable to do so, as Randy would go on to win the whole thing. And a month after that, at Elimination Chamber, Bray Wyatt would finally reach the top of the mountain himself when he won the titular main event match to become the WWE Champion for the first time. So this of course set up a WrestleMania match between the two for the title, one which, still pledging his allegiance to the family, Orton would initially refuse to take part in. Ultimately though, the Viper would reveal that he'd been stringing Bray along too, just waiting for the right moment to strike, as on the February 28th episode of SmackDown, he would set fire to the Wyatt family compound, from there announcing he would be taking on Bray at WrestleMania. And of course, when the time for that match came, it would be the babyface Orton who would get the win, with this seeming to put the final nail in the coffin of the Wyatt family once and for all. And while it could have been so much more if it had been booked correctly, it still represented one of the most interesting and unique stables in recent memory, one which was able to establish Bray Wyatt as a main event player while also acting as a springboard for the likes of Braun Strowman. Sure, it's sad that at various points they became little more than glorified jobbers, and it's even sadder that they were never able to capitalize on how over they were in the lead-up to WrestleMania 30, but that's more of an issue with modern-day WWE than with any of the men involved. And once things were over, each of them would go on their own paths finally, with Strowman continuing his rise to the top of the main event scene over on Raw, while on SmackDown, Harper and Rowan would reunite to form the Bludgeon Brothers for a while, all before the former would get his release from his contract in 2020 as he then went over to AEW to have a career-best run as Mr. Brody Lee, the leader of the Dark Order. Sadly though, Brody would unexpectedly pass away on Boxing Day of that year, and as a tribute to him then, Eric Rowan, who by that point had also been released from WWE, would make an appearance at his tribute show on the December 30th episode of Dynamite. And it's a shame that he'd been released by then too, as prior to this, he'd been building ground as the tag partner of Daniel Bryan, at one point even becoming SmackDown Tag Team Champions with him. But what of the group's leader Bray Wyatt himself? Well, after the breakup, he would spend some time floundering as the company increasingly didn't know what to do with him. That was until he took matters into his own hands in 2019 and metamorphosed into the Fiend, a horror movie villain birthed from his warped psyche that, for a while, was the most over character in WWE. Since then, though, Bray has been released from his contract too, and with Braun Strowman's release coming soon after this, it meant that all four members of the Wyatt family were now gone from the company, with this leaving little chance of any reunions in the future. So with that finality set, we can look back on the group for what it was at its best, and that was an outlet for one of the most creative men in the industry to build a mythology around himself that got him and his partners more over than almost anyone else on the roster. Partners who included some of the most underutilized big men in wrestling, and who, as later events would show, had it in them to be main eventers too if given the ball to run with. And in the end, all they ever had to do to achieve this, as it turned out, was to follow the Buzzards. Well guys, what did you think of the video? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to smash the like button, subscribe to the channel, as well as follow Wrestle with Andy on Instagram and Twitter. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.